Welcome to Marx 213. In this session, we're going to read and discuss with the brilliant critical philosopher Judith Revel Marx's 1842 articles titled Debates on the Law on the Thefts of Wood, published in the Rheinische Zeitung in 1842, through the lens and in conversation with Foucault's work on the punitive society, specifically his two lecture series at the Collège de France, Penal Theories and Institutions from 72, and the Punitive Society from 1973, and his book on the prisons, Discipline and Punish. It's a treat and a privilege to have Judith Revel with us today, one of the world's leading authorities on Foucault's writings, and one of the most perceptive interpreters of his work. So it's particularly wonderful to have you at this session where we'll be working on Foucault and Marx. I will introduce Judith Revel in a moment. Let me just give a little background about this seminar. Marx's 1842 articles on the thefts of wood were fetish texts among critical legal scholars, critical sociologists, Marxist historians, and radical lawyers during the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. Now, the articles do not typically appear in the canon of Marx's political writings. They are absent, for instance, kind of pregnantly absent from the classic exhaustive American compendium, the Marx-Engels Reader, that Robert C. Tucker edited. And they're considered by some, following Louis Althusser, as still tainted by the liberal rationalist moment of Marx's youthful writings. They even predate by a few months Marx's engagement with Hegel's philosophy of right and his attack on the left Hegelians. As a result, the thefts of wood don't usually figure in the typical bibliography of political, philosophical, and economic writings of Marx. But those articles were a touchstone for a set of critical thinkers in law, history, sociology, and radical lawyers during the 1970s. They upended criminology, creating a whole new flank of critical criminologists, and nourished a whole body of Marxist historiography. And for good cause. Marx's articles captured succinctly the violence and brutality of the struggle between landowners and the poor in 19th century Germany. They revealed how the criminal law and punishment could be instrumentalized by the wealthy to dispossess the downtrodden. They showed the violence of capital accumulation. They represented Marx's first foray into material interests. And in his own words, they, quote, gave me the first impulse to take up the study of economic questions. Now, in the 1970s, Marxist historians and critical sociologists and lawyers would do precisely that work, the political economic work. British social historians like E.P. Thompson, Peter Linebaugh, and the group that collectively assembled the classic work, Albion's Fatal Tree, Crime and Society in 18th century England, including Douglas Hay. In Italy, critical criminologists like Dario Melossi, pioneers in the field, would marshal Marx's articles and help spark a new strand of Marxist criminology. In the United States, American critical legal scholars like Duncan Kennedy, Michael Tiger, and others at the founding of the critical legal studies movement in the 1970s would turn to these texts, a movement in law and legal theory that brought together strands of critical and social theories, structuralism and post-structuralism in the 1970s. In France, the renowned critical jurist and penologist Pierre Lascoumes would turn to the text and write about them, as well as the critical legal scholar Mikhaïl Xifaras, who is joining us on Zoom, I hope. Yes, I see you. Hi, Michel. Together, those critical thinkers would layer the political economy, the critical legal theory, the critical criminology onto the work that Marx had begun with his blistering critique of how the Rhine provincial legislatures had turned a customary privilege of the poor into a crime. Now, of course, Michel Foucault, and that's what we'll be talking about, and Judith will elaborate, was steeped in these debates, especially of the historians, when he turned in 1973 to explore the construction of the delinquent and the disciplinary power in his lectures at the Collège de France, the Punitive Society. The year before, in his lectures on penal theories and institutions, he had dedicated the half of the year to this detailed analysis of the uprisings of the Nu-Pieds in Normandy in 1639 and its repression by Richelieu and the Chancelier Séguier. So he was steeped in the querulous territory of historians, and he would return himself to these Marx articles on the theft of wood in the shadow as a stepping stone to develop his theory of illegalisms, his analysis of the subjectivation of the delinquent subject, his discussion of the development of the criminal as the social enemy in the 19th century, and of course his genealogy of the prison. He read the articles closely, annotated them as a student. His fiches de lecture actually are in the archives at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. They're available online if you want them. They're on the website. You can click on them and you can see them there. And so he was returning to these texts and of course, all of the historical work to develop his own. Of course, other brilliant critical scholars would then pick up on these threads on Marx and Foucault and push them further, whether it's James C. Scott building on Marx and Foucault to develop what he called infrapolitics, those political struggles from below, the ordinary acts of resistance that he spoke about, or other critical theorists who would be building on Marx and Foucault on crime, as well as others, W.E.B. Du Bois, for instance, Ruschen Kirchheimer, the early Angela Davis, George Jackson, and others, to argue for penal abolition. In fact, you could almost draw a straight line from these thinkers to the present, to the powerful abolitionist movement today, and the writing of abolitionists, and especially feminist abolitionists, including Angela Davis, Mariam Kaba, Dorothy Roberts, Sarah Haley, Derricka Purnell, and others. So for a moment, why start with the thefts of wood? Why start in 1842? Of course, we all know that, Althusser maintained that these early writings really reflected a Marx who was still, in his words, enslaved to the dominant ideology in which he was raised. And Althusser spoke about these thick layers of illusions that he had to break through in his own work and his own biography. And for Althusser, it just showed glimpses, really, of him liberating himself from that ideology, but not a worthy text, and really. But I think that fails to acknowledge the import of these articles and the remarkable work they did and can do. In these writings, Marx severs the relationship between crime and punishment and exposes the violence and brutality of class struggle in a remarkable way. And as I was rereading them, I remembered why I wanted to start here in 1842, and not just with Hegel and Feuerbach, right? But with crime and material interests and class warfare. When Marx recalls that these materials confronted him with materialism and prompted to study political economy, that's important. It's the place to start. As Peter Linebaugh writes, or wrote back in 1976, faced with his own and Engels' evidence regarding how these articles, the import of these articles from Marx's own development, we must therefore beware of those accounts of the development of Marx's ideas that see it in the exclusive terms of either the self-liberation from the problematics of left Hegelianism or the outcome of a political collision that his ideas had with the French utopian and revolutionary tradition that he met during his exile in Paris. The famous trinity, French politics, German philosophy, and English political economy, of the intellectual lineage of Marx's critical analysis of the capital modes of production appears to include everything but the actual material form in which class struggle first forced itself to the attention of the young radical in 1842. So, the importance of crime and punishment. All right. At this seminar, Marx 213, we will focus primarily then on Marx's text and Foucault's work on the punitive society. That's what makes it so important to have with us Judith Revel, who again is one of the most subtle and insightful readers of Foucault. A professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris, Judith Revel has written groundbreaking work on Foucault and other contemporary philosophers, including Merleau-Ponty, in works such as Foucault, Expérience de la pensée, Foucault, Une pensée du discontinu, Foucault avec Merleau-Ponty, and many other works. And she directed the Italian edition of the Foucault's Dit and Écrit. Judith Revel will explore with us the unique way in which Foucault weaved together the analysis of penality, of penal institutions, theories, and practices on the one hand, and the study of political economy and the birth of capitalism on the other. She'll focus on these questions of subjectivation of the constitution of illegal subjects through acts and practices, both from the kind of top down and from the bottom up, as it were, through the subjectivities and the new creation of subjectivations. And I think she will argue that these anticipate the rumbling of the battle at the end of Discipline and Punish. So Judith Revel will present for us, and then if I have the time, I'll add a few elements on the way in which Marx's analysis in these articles on the theft of wood and Foucault's work on the punitive society form a historical strain of thought that leads inexorably to abolition today. Welcome to 213, and welcome Judith Revel.
Wow, what a presentation.
Yeah,
yeah, so it's my translation. So it's probably full of mistakes, errors, and so on. Well, first and foremost, of course, I'd like to thank Bernard Harcourt for organizing this great seminar series. I was thinking this morning that I have taken part in 5 CCCCT seminars since 2016. So this year is my 6th, and I'm delighted and proud of it.
Merci.
Thank you. I can't begin, however, without apologizing a little for my presence in this context. I'm not a Marx specialist, and what justifies my intervention today has more to do with the structure chosen for this year, the fact that we have to relate to Marx through the prism of a reading, and in my case, the reading is that of Michel Foucault, but this reading is neither a truly direct reading, a commentary, nor an explicit reading, a reference that claims to be such. Not direct because it's mediated by a series of debates among Marxists, philosophers, historians, which Foucault uses to construct his own thinking, and not explicit because, unlike the other seminars in this Marx 1313, Foucault does not work Marx really. And when he does refer to him, this reference seems to remain on the fringe. So in a sense, we have to go looking for it. And this is what the editors of the 2 series of the courses of the Collège de France in 1971-72, Théorie Institution Pénale, and in 1972-73, La Société Punitive, and in particular Bernard Harcourt, who was in charge of the critical editing and the course context of both, have done. But maybe it's also a bit what Foucault himself suggests when, at the end of the lecture of February 28th, 1973, Foucault remarks, I quote, "It does not need the silence of the unsaid for the intelligence, the profundity of the interpreter to rush in and find what the others could not say. Actually, the others have always said everything. The problem, therefore, is not to seek in the lacunae of a text the force or effects of an unsaid. I say it in French, but I think it's clear. Nul besoin du non-dit pour y précipiter l'intelligence, la profondeur de l'interprète, qui trouvera ce que les autres n'ont pas pu dire. En fait, les autres ont toujours tout dit. Le problème n'est donc pas de chercher dans les lacunes d'un texte la force ou l'effet d'un non-dit. Well, a note from the editors underlines the almost kinship of this statement with the idea of a symptomatic reading, la lecture symptomale in an Althusserian sense of the term. But what interests me here is not so much the possible draw of a diagonal between Foucault and Althusser, and to say that Foucault's near absence of Marx says something in its own way. Rather, it's to ask ourselves what we are doing when we decide to read a certain Foucault and a certain Marx in a crossed way, to cut out not concepts or theses, but questions, which means not only finding Marxian echoes in Foucault, but perhaps also enlighten Marx through Foucault, which is more illogical. And I'd like to show that Foucault thought is not an anti-Marxism, which is Etienne Balibar's oft-stated thesis, nor even a counter-Marxism, which is quite different and which is Bernard Harcourt's thesis in the course context of penal theories and institutions, but something like an alter Marxism, a cutting out within Marxian analysis of certain specific elements that Foucault introduces into the movement of his own work, a work constantly stretched between three poles. First, the question of power relations, and immediately the question of practices, discourses, and institutions that support these relations of power. Second, the question of the representation of history that the development and transformation of these relations of power understood in the historicity presupposes. And third, finally, the question of the ways in which the subject is constituted. That is, both the question of the production of a subjected subject and that of the possibility of the autopoiesis, self-poiesis of a social and political subject constituted by its own practices, foreshadowing what the last line of Discipline and Punish will call, with this expression so beautiful from a literary point of view, but so enigmatic from a political one, the rumble of battle, le grondement de la bataille, which may not be as distant as the English translation suggests, distant roar of the battle, adding this distant, which is not in the French text. To conclude this brief introduction, I'd like to say a few words about the corpus mobilized in this cross-reading Foucault-Marx, Marx-Foucault. As I had just said, and as Bernard said before me, we have the two lecture series at the Collège de France. The first penal series and institution focuses in his first half on the question of popular riots in the 17th and 18th centuries, and in particular on the Révolte des Pieds Nus in Normandy in 1639, 1640. And then in its second half, it presents a vast history of the transformations of penalty since the Middle Ages. This is the first. The second course on the punitive society focuses on the emergence of the figure of the criminal social enemy, based on an analysis of the history of penalty and the institution of prison. In both cases, as Bernard Harcourt has shown, there are at least two possible subtext to Foucault's analysis. For the first course, the debate between Boris Porchnev and Roland Mounier, or more exactly between Mounier and Porchnev, it's the other sense, on the interpretation to be given to popular movements in the 17th century, of which the Nu-Pieds are an example. And I will try to show that Foucault attempts to propose a third interpretation. And for the second course of the Collège de France, the close discussion of a number of hypotheses formulated by E.P. Thompson, particularly around the idea of moral economy of the crowd, a very important text on the moral economy of the English crowd in the 18th century, had been published by E.P. Thompson in Past and Present in 1971. That is exactly the same moment. But also around the idea of a social and political constitution of the working class, or around the question of depredations. To these two fundamental lecture series at the Collège de France, we must add the publication of Discipline and Punish in 1975, and I will focus on two moments in particular: the very end of the first chapter of the second part, Generalized Punishment, and the second chapter of the fourth part at the end of the book, Illegalities and Delinquency. And here, Foucault develops the idea that the production of illegalities, serves both to objectify through law and to distribute through a whole general economy the different phases and different social utilities or inutilities of delinquency. But it also raises, it seems to me, the question of the possible positive and collective constitution of a subject, not only given nor constituted within the meshes of power in which it finds itself trapped. That is to say, also identified and managed by and through all the discourses, knowledge, practices, and institutions that claim to apply to it, but constructed, as it were, by its own practices. Here, for example, practices of depredation or dissipation, and I will come back to this point. About Marx, things are apparently simpler. Let us go back 6 years before the thesis on Feuerbach that Etienne Balibar talked about last Tuesday, and let us look at the impressive ensemble which constitutes this text written by Marx and published in several issues between October 25th and November 3rd, 1842. Marx was then 24 years old, in the Rheinische Zeitung, founded in January the same year, and of which Marx and Bruno Bauer had become editors in the spring, before Marx finally became editor-in-chief in October the same year. The text analyzes and criticizes the deliberation of the Rhine Province Assembly, la Diète, on the question of the theft of wood, the characterization of pilfering of rami, small dead twigs, that is dead wood, precisely as theft, which gives Marx the opportunity to question both the juridical evolution of the concept of property and ultimately what he identifies as the customs for privileged classes and the customary right for the poor, the way in which the right as the defense of property also and above all becomes the defense of private interests, privatizing, so to speak, its public vocation. Foucault makes only one brief reference to this text by Marx at the beginning of his lecture of January 24th, 1973, in reference to the emergence of the criminal as a social enemy And after evoking the debate on what to do with this criminal as social enemy, exile him, kill him, or on the contrary, have society itself take him into account, that is, imprison him. Foucault says, I quote, "Such a debate allows us to study the theoretical political effect of this principle of the criminal social enemy. It also provides a reference for the analysis of a theoretical political discussion. The analysis would, for example, have to take into account what Marx wrote regarding the discussion of the theft of wood, and what Blanqui, 15 years later, wrote on what took place regarding rights of wine." And Foucault adds, "Starting from these models, we could maybe see how to analyze political discussions, oppositions, and struggles of discourse within a given political situation." This is my emphasis. And of course, this last sentence, which can be understood as an explicit recall to the necessity of historicizing analysis, can also be read in another way as an invitation to decentralize our questioning in the direction of our own present. It is therefore a question of the heuristic and political utility of this text, doubly historical. Marx, 1842, Foucault, 130 years later. But it's also a question of our own present, which is formulated here. As time is running out, I will proceed in bullet points. One, Marx. Many comments have been made on this Marx text. I'm deliberately leaving aside the question of the status to be accorded to this very young Marx, a Marx even younger than the young Marx of the 1844 manuscripts, because I'm not interested in that today. It's interesting, but it's not my question today. Regardless of this, the commentaries of the text, you mentioned Mikhaïl Xifaras, Pierre Lascoumes on the legal side, E.P. Thompson or Peter Linebaugh on the Marxian analysis of something as a history from below, seem to be organized around almost three sets of problems. The first, of course, is the question of property and the evolution of its definition, that is also the evolution of its defense. Is pilfering dead wood the same as stealing green living wood by uprooting or cutting down the tree? The old distinction in Roman law between a thing that belongs to a person, res propria, a thing that, because it doesn't belong to anyone, can be appropriated, res nullius, and a thing that, because it is common to all, cannot be appropriated, res communis. It's sometimes superimposed here on another possible definition of property, which also seems to require a very different status for twigs than for green wood, a definition, more classical definition, that derives the right to property from the recognition of the fruits of labor and guarantees the positivity of this labor property link through the institution of law, as found, for example, in the second treatise of civil government by Locke. This is the first set. The second set of problem is an analysis of criminalization of thefts of wood in the social and political context in which it took place. A hardening of the law linked in particular to the reassurance of landowners. And here the law also serves to harden social divisions, to make them more watertight, to segment more clearly the distribution of social affiliations and their privileges. where sometimes a few spaces of indetermination still existed. The collection of dead wood was one of these spaces of indetermination induced by a widely recognized right of use, established by a customary law of the poor. It applied de facto to an object, the dead wood, that no longer belonged to the tree from which it had fallen, a tree that belonged to the landowner, nor was the fruit of a human labor. It therefore belonged to no one. But this indetermination was precisely to become the object of a twofold transformation, of which the law of the Rhenish Assembly was the expression. From a penal point of view, the transformation of the theft of dead wood into a crime and the expulsion from the sphere of law of an entire system of customary practices, which were on the exact boundary between the legal and the illegal. And from a civil point of view, the hardening of the concept of property. The second set of comments, therefore, focuses also on what is said in the Marxian text about law, its relationship to the state on the one hand, and to private interests on the other, or on the distinction that Marx suggests, for example, in customary law, the distinction between customary rights of the aristocracy, which reject the form of general law because they invest social spaces and relation precisely in absence of any law, and the customary right of the poor, which constitute an anticipation of the right and which, in Marx's extraordinary expression in the text of October 27th, testify to a juridical instinct or an instinctive sense of rights of the poor. Finally, the third set focuses on the practices of certain sections of peasantry in the 18th century, poaching, pilfering, plundering, theft, and reintegrates the Marxian text into the broader framework of an analysis of social struggles, particularly in 18th and 19th century England. But we could, by widening the historical framework still further, reintegrate wood stealing into a more general set of seditious practices, that is, revolts, riots against the established order, uprising, insurrections since the 17th century. Now, I believe that it's precisely at the crossing, the intersection of these 3 points that Foucault stands with his own questions between 1971 and 1975. And that some of the questions he formulated during this period will be destined to remain with him for a long time, even in totally other contexts. I'm thinking, for example, of the question of the popular uprising, which we'll find again in 1978, when Foucault will try to analyze the Iranian Revolution, or to use a beautiful expression from Bernard's context course, which puts it in a more abstract way, the question of knowing, I quote, what it is to be an act in actuality, what it is to be an act in actuality. That is the question of interrupting the given order of things. So Foucault wants to run an analysis of the emergence of a new system of law, gradually emerging both from medieval articulations and from its first modern formulation, which transforms into another, its either to essential function, the symbolic restoration of the order violated by an act considered criminal. This is what is at stake in the ceremony of power and in the economy of punishment. This new function will be twofold. Through the constitution of knowledge, practices, and institution, the aim is to understand that the emergence of punishment is both a repressive device, un dispositif répressif, and a kind of matrix of social organization or reorganization. The analysis of the repression of the nu-pieds, which takes up more than half of penal theories and institutions, as a double purpose. On the one hand, the work on the nu-pieds revolt, and the way in which it was repressed, and on the other, the way in which we move from the designation of the population as a social enemy to the production of delinquency. The pairing of sedition and repression becomes the pairing of delinquency and the penal system, the penalty. But this modern birth of penalty does more than simply repress. In its application, it organizes and redistributes places and is at the heart of a productive matrix that is that of a whole new economy of power, and which will ultimately constitute a whole new political economy. This is the hypothesis of on the punitive society. And it will also be the hypothesis of discipline and punish, except that in the 1975 book, the question of the transformation of the concept of wealth from land, titles, and privileges to the possession of capital, that is, all the means of production, raises for the first time not only the question of the repression of seditionists, but also that of the necessity to attach the bodies to work, l'accrochage des corps au travail, and the extraction of what Foucault calls productive performances, prestations productives. The coupling of the docility and the utility is the question of the productivity of bodies, the question of work in the transformation that accompanies the emergence of the factory structures. Allow me to digress briefly on this point. In La vérité et les formes juridiques, Truth and Juridical Forms, Foucault's 1973 lectures in Rio de Janeiro, the work plan of Foucault is still to move from the historical phenomenon of putting bodies at work to an analysis of the prison. Foucault writes, I'm sorry, it's my translation because I didn't find the English translation of the text. The aim of factories, schools, prisons, and hospitals is to bind the individual to a process of production, training or correction of producers. It's about guaranteeing production or producers according to a given norm. We can therefore contrast the seclusion of the 18th century, which excludes the individual from the social circle, with the seclusion that appears in the 19th century, whose function is to bind the individual to the apparatus of production, of training, of reform, or of correction of producers. End of quote. In the Brazilian lectures on 1973, the analysis thus seems to antepose the problem of production and the disciplinarization of individuals for work, to work, to that of the prison, and more generally to that of a disciplinary institution, making the latter, production, a key to reading the former disciplinary institutions. And Foucault continues in the same conference lecture. Already in the instance of control that emerged from the 19th century onwards, the body takes on a completely different meaning. It is no longer the one that must be tortured, but the one that must be trained, reformed, corrected, that must acquire skills, acquire a certain set of qualities, be qualified as a body capable of working. Well, in Discipline and Punish, the scheme will be reversed. The great book on the birth of prison contains the analysis of docile bodies. How can Foucault be useful in rereading Marx on theft of wood? Probably because he displaces his own questioning in relation to the way in which the Marxian text is generally read. I began by mentioning Porchneff and Mounier, to whom Claude Olivier Doron dedicates his essay Foucault and the Historians at the end of Penalty, Theories and Institutions. On both sides, Porchneff and Mounier, even if in opposite ways, it is a question of identifying the seditious subject within the framework of a society of orders, Mounier, or within the framework of a society of classes, Porchneff. The nature of sedition is thus determined by the subject who carries it out. It presupposes a subject whose social and political identity must be stated. The hypothesis that Foucault seems me to be constructing between the lines in these same years is totally different. A certain set of practices can, of course, be requalified by the modification of what we might call a general economy of power relations in a given society. But we must not forget that these same practices function as matrices of subjectivation. They literally constitute the subject who performs them. And it is precisely the double dimension that the use of the term illegalism seems to me to name. If I insist on this question of subjectivation, it's because the question of the generalization of punishment, which will be described in Discipline and Punish, is also the question of the double objectivation it makes possible, that of the crime and that of the criminal. To counter this objectivation and to analyze illegalism not only as what will soon become a true production of a delinquency and the penal apparatus attached to it, but also as the set of gestures by which disobedient social and political subjects institute themselves as such. Having read Foucault's later texts, we know that a subject is inseparably produced by subjection, that is, through the set of practices and discourses that constitute it paradoxically as an object, and subjectivation, subjection and subjectivation, that is, through the set of gestures by which it institutes itself as a subject. The two are inseparable. There is never either objective saturation or absolute subjectivation. Perhaps this is why sedition, revolt, riots, uprisings are an event. They are constituents. I insist on this because it's exactly what we also find in the analysis of E.P. Thompson. At the time of his 2 lectures series at the Collège de France, Foucault could not have been familiar with the Whigs and Hunters, the origins of the Black Act, because the text has been published in 1975 and very recently translated into French as La guerre des forêts, lutte sociale dans l'Angleterre du XVIIIe siècle. But Bernard Harcourt's editorial work shows just how present the making of the English working class is in the analysis of Foucault. The dimension of making, of course, is what interests me here. The first sentence of E.P. Thompson preface makes this very clear. I quote, "This book has a clumsy title, but it is one of which meets its purpose, making, because it's a study of an active process which owes as much to agency as to conditioning. The working class did not rise like the sun at an appointed time. It was present at its own making." Was present at its own making. It's beautiful. And then by class, I understand a historical phenomenon that unifies a number of disparate and seemingly unconnected events, both in the raw material of experience and in consciousness. I emphasize that it is a historical phenomenon. I do not see class as a structure, nor even as a category, but as something which in fact happens and can be shown to have happened in human relationship. End of quote. Something that happens, something that constitutes the subject as such, would say Foucault. On this point, I would like to add a second element that might strengthen the parallelism between Foucault's research and E.P. Thompson's analysis. This second element is, of course, the notion of the moral economy of the crowd at the heart of the very famous article published in 1971 in Past and Present. What the two approaches have in common, it seems to me, is the decentering of analysis in the direction of practices, that is, gestures, understood in their own dimension. Gestures that produce subjectivity, gestures that carry a system of values that the poor express, act, and recognize for themselves. In all cases, it's more important to bring to light ways of living and doing collective behaviors in a specific place and time than to determine identities and the historical interpretation they imply. Of course, this does not mean forgetting that these gestures are part of a complex economy of power relations with its own history, the emergence of punishment as a new social grammar, it's an obvious example. But it does mean endowing these gestures with a value that sometimes deploys its own field of principle, as found in E.P. Thompson, or sometimes signifies its own refusal, as found, for example, in Foucault's analysis of the transformation of plunder, of depredation, into dissipation in the lesson of March 14th, 1973. Foucault analyzes nomadism, refusal to work, partying, debauchery, all ways of setting up a certain way of life against discipline, against the productive and reproductive injunctions to work and family. In short, gestures produce subjectivation, conflict, marginal resistance. Gestures speak. Well, as time runs and my fatigue increases and my English worsens, I'd like to end with a series of openings, since the seminar is also quite deliberately an exercise in order to question and perhaps also enlighten our own present. I'd like to pick out 4 of these possible openings from Marx crossing Foucault. Probably there are many others, but these seem to me the most obvious and maybe the most urgent. The question of property. A question raised by Marx in the context of the criminalization of a customary practice, the pilfering of dead wood, but which we could well take up again today, both from the point of view of criminalization. For example, there are dozens of cases on the internet of supermarket cashiers being fired for stealing expired or discarded goods. And from the point of view of a new legal definition of the commons, understood as res communis. This is the terrain explored, for example, by the economist Elinor Ostrom, when she tried to understand how communities can provide themselves with a set of rules for managing their own commons, a set of rules which doesn't include property. The question of history. I haven't mentioned it for lack of time, but it seems to me that in the 1842 text, Marx still very clearly has a conception of history that is that of a young left-wing Hegelian. The question of the juridical instinct expressed by the customary right of the poor, which is mentioned at the beginning, which I mentioned at the beginning, suggests something like an intuition that must tend towards the realized form of legal law, that is, that of the universal and necessary general law. This history is quite different from the one Marx will sketch in the last chapters of the first book of Capital. I'm thinking of chapters 26 and following on primitive accumulation. The question of the kind of representation of history one gives oneself is obviously also at the heart of the polemic between Porchneff and Mounier. And it's also at the heart of E.P. Thompson's historiographical gesture. And all this, of course, has been said far too quickly. My question, however, concerns Foucault. It's actually the question I ask myself, and it's at the heart of my own work. What form of history can account for both, on one hand, a history of the transformation of what Foucault would later call rationalities of government, which in the early 70s was still a history of the discourses, practices, and institutions that run through a society. And on the other hand, a history of all those events which within a tightly woven network of power relations maintain against all odds the possibility of what is not only an agency, partial agency of the subjugated, of the subjected, but a self-production, at least partially autonomous subjectivation of these subjected, a self-constitution of as political subjects within the meshes of power. In other words, what kind of history can restore both the complex regime of historical determinations specific to a given moment and that of rupture? A history which could accept in itself the line of the event, as Deleuze would say, or the line of the possible difference, la différence possible, as the last Foucault would name it in 1984. The question of subjects. How can we account for the constitution of subjects, not only individually, but collectively on the basis of their practices? No practice, no gesture is infra-political if it opens up a space of subjectivation. But this presupposes, from an epistemological point of view, a kind of a Copernican revolution. The subject is no longer considered as the condition of possibility of practices. And secondly, the key to any interpretation of a given historical situation no longer rests on the prior identification of the nature of this or that subject, as was the case, for example, in opposite and symmetrical versions with Porchneff and Mounier. On the contrary, the subject becomes the effect of its own practices. These practices naturally settle down and accumulates themselves, revealing at a given moment a certain state of the subject. But this should not erase the idea that the subject is an effect of practices and not their cause and their exclusive principle of explanation. Finally, the question of law. The whole history of the last 2 centuries is, at least in part, the history of the conquest of law, or perhaps we should say the history of the struggles and the advances in law that these struggles have made possible in the affirmation of a certain number of freedoms that are considered fundamental and which, it seems to me, constitute, for example, one of the essential issues of the constitutional law. But we should also remember, for example, the lesson of January 14th, 1976, society must be defended. Before trying to ask what the echo of all this in our own present might be, Foucault says, and I quote, the translation is mine, sorry, against the usurpations of disciplinary mechanics, against the rise of a power linked to scientific knowledge, we found ourselves today in such a situation that the only existing apparently solid recourse we have is precisely the recourse or return to a law organized around sovereignty, articulated on this old principle. So in concrete terms, when we want to object the disciplines and all the effects of knowledge and power associated with them, what do we actually do? What do you do in real life? What does the Syndicat de la Magistrature or other such institutions do? What do we do if not to invoke this right, this famous formal and bourgeois right, which is in reality the right of sovereignty? Foucault's position in the mid-70s is quite clear and deserves to be discussed, and deserves to be discussed now. The conquest of the law, the extension of the guarantees of the law have worked and are still working against the unbridled deployment of disciplines, that is, the investment of our bodies put to work and of whole lives considered as conditions of possibility of the productivity of bodies. But they can only do this by reactivating bourgeois formal law and not by moving towards what Habermas, for example, would call the political universal morality, of what we could perhaps in his wake, but in a different way, quite different way, call universal and unconditional fundamental rights, or right of the common. So my question is, and I ask it all the more openly and unconsciously because I'm not a philosopher or law or a jurist, and I don't know if it makes sense, but it's up to you. In 2024, what kind of reference can we have to right? And of course, what kind of right? What might today be the right of the poor or the right of the subjected, as Marx asks us to think?
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Thank you so much for that enlightening and rich intervention. Brilliant, as always. Thank you so much. I feel somewhat interpolated by your last question. So let me propose this. Let me try and answer it as best I can. Then let me try to pull some strands from your presentation, and then let me ask you a question. And by the way, Judith's presentation is in English, and we'll also put it in French, will be on the website. So if you want to go back to it and refer to it and reread it and use it and engage it,
the French is better.
You can do that. So yeah, everything's on the also an introduction, etc. And you can put the slide back if you want. Okay. So the question is, what might today be the right of the poor or the right of the subjected? What kind of reference can we have to right? And of course, what kind of right? That's a question that I think we've been asking ourselves in the critical legal tradition, in the American critical legal tradition for decades. It's certainly, I think it was the source in a way, the conflict between a critical theory and theories of rights were what pretty much gave rise to critical legal studies in the 1970s. The confrontation, that is, of, on the one hand, lawyers using liberal rights schemes to try and change the world at the time, but to use them in a way that seemed to some to be reformist effectively, and not sufficiently changing the structures or the political economy in a way that would have effects. I think that was the source of the tension that gave rise to critical legal studies, that gave rise to critical race theory, and that is at the source of so much debate. And it's something that is that haunts me in particular, because, as you know, I practice in mostly in Alabama, death penalty cases, and I have no choice but to use the language of rights that dominates, and that we might think of as being inadequate. But we have no other choice, no other language, no other way to actually perform in the courts something that would be legible, that could be heard, other than to speak in the language of due process. And so it's something that haunts me. And of course, it's aggravated by it's aggravated by Marx's text on the vol des bois, and it's aggravated by Foucault's work on the punitive society and the construction of a penitentiary system, because of the kind of, the way in which it becomes easy to think of the law as an oppressive, coercive mechanism, which it is, and which you see so well in the vol des bois, for instance. I mean, all of the work that from various different Marxist traditions and from various different critical traditions transformed law into some form of ideology that itself reproduces inequalities and social hierarchies, etc. And as those being so powerful and so omnipresent and so deep and so having such a grip on us, right? The more we explore those different forms, whether directly, as in law being used by the privileged in the thefts of wood to criminalize a whole class and conduct, or law being a mere ideology, right? Though, but an ideology that kind of subconsciously kind of reproduces forms of domination and hierarchy. Right? All of those critical theories leave us in a position where it's almost questionable whether we could use law as a liberating force, as an emancipating force, right? And those, I think, those are the questions that are ongoing now, in the wake of in the wake of critical legal studies, with the movement now of law and political economy, for instance, and I'd say a few things. So I mean, a lot of people are thinking about what this law of the something could look like. You have to understand that in the 1960s, at least in the United States, there was an enormous movement to create a law of poverty. It was called a law of the poor, a law of poverty. Many important constitutional scholars were involved in that project, Frank Michelman and others, in trying to create actually a law of poverty that would have been a constitutional law that would have protected and transformed questions of poverty and addressed questions of poverty. That was a major constitutional effort. Of course, it came at a time when there were significant constitutional transformations taking place. You know, it was coming at the end of the Warren Court, but it was an attempt to use the Warren Court to create a law of poverty. It failed. I mean, it didn't hold, and it didn't work. And so, in that absence, there have been a lot of efforts. I'd say that today, some of the conversation is turning around actually what Katerina Pistor talks about in terms of the code of capital, Also, a book she's working on is the law of capitalism. But this idea of trying to understand how the legal mechanisms that make the capitalist political economy, the way in which it is in fact human-made, made by lawyers, all of the ways in which it can be coded and is coded. And of course, that gives you the idea that, well, if it's made this way, it could also be made another way. And so one of the directions that I'm working on and pushing is something I would like to call the law of cooperation, which would be a different set of, sometimes using similar tools, but a different set of legal structures, legal ways of thinking that would, instead of generating capitalist product, would actually generate cooperation, right? Again, from this idea of law being human-made, right? And products being human-made. And the idea of cooperation would be thinking about all the ways in which actually we can facilitate through legal mechanisms forms of cooperation. And there are some brilliant people who are doing this. Kali Akuno down at Cooperation Jackson is a brilliant maker of the law of cooperation, always figuring out how to create an LLC, or because there isn't a cooperative structure that exists, but how to create something legally that would allow forms of the common. And so here we're talking about communal land trusts or whatever. It's just figuring out what those devices are to facilitate the political projects of cooperation. So that would be one answer, but you're hitting a sore spot, obviously, a sore spot which was at the source of an entire critique of rights that came out of the critical legal studies movement, and that has left a lot of people unsure as to how then to deploy the law. But I think there are ways, and I think that where I would want to push it would be towards a law of cooperation, not to suggest in some historical sense that there is a law of cooperation or something, or that we're headed towards cooperation, but actually in a very tangible sense that it is possible to kind of completely restructure the tools and the legal devices in a way to favor cooperation rather than capital competition. All right, so that's one, and hopefully we can open this up. I know Mikhaïl Xifaras is on the line and other people. I think I see um, Kendall Thomas is on the line. So, of course, Kendall Thomas at Columbia Law School, who is one of the brilliant minds behind critical race theory, and who would have a lot to say about that question. What might today be the right of the poor or the right of the subjected? Okay, so we'll open that up. Let me quickly, though, suggest that it seems to me that there are different strands in your presentation that are worth both teasing apart and then asking about their relationship. Four different strands, maybe. The first, and all of these kind of come out of the work that Marx and Foucault were doing. The first would be more about using these materials to study how social control is exercised by the state and parts of society. And so this is more of the top-down dimension, the way in which, in this case, the criminal law is instrumentalized and deployed, the way that punishment, for instance, serves to enforce a racial hierarchy or perpetuating racialized mass incarceration, or a sexual hierarchy by targeting transgender persons. And here I think one dimension is to develop all of the ways in which these practices of state and social apparatuses to interrogate how they interact with political economic developments. And we've done that in the context of what's been called neoliberal penality, for instance, or in the context of racial capitalism, to see how those mechanisms that we see in Marx's text, right? The imposing the law, redefining property, how those interact with political economic developments, and then how they can serve to entrench social hierarchies, what role ideology plays in that, or regimes of truth, depending on how you come at it epistemologically. Okay, then the other dimension, of course, is the way in which forms of resistance from those who are most impacted, the precarious, etc., the bottom-up dimension of how those forms of resistance operate, how they create self-understandings and self-consciousnesses of resistance. And those are all the questions of subjectivation that you raised and that you find so important, and that are so important in the work that Foucault was doing on subjectivation and desubjectivation. So we can investigate how people are interpolated, not just by the police, as Althusser suggests, but by protest, by resistance, by mobilization, how that transforms them. And we can trace the different histories of different forms of uprisings, different forms of riots, maybe different forms of political disobedience, of the other ways in which social protest is expressed and understood and forms individuals and subjects. The third dimension that I hear, of course, has to do with kind of questioning the very apparatus of the criminal law. And as Foucault did, trying to break that link between crime and punishment to open up new horizons, possibly new horizons for a world without punishment. Now, in addition to those three spatial dimensions, there's also the temporal dimension, I think, that we hear in your work that's so important. And that's the dimension of how do these forms of rebellion evolve on a historical trajectory? What do they amount to? What is their sequence? What are their continuities and their discontinuities, their disruptions? Are they how important are they to historical events in particular? How do they change over time? Uh, uh, Joshua Clover's work on, right, like riot, strike, riot, right, or riot, strike, riot, prime was what he originally had in mind, or the different ways in which at different times there are different forms of, uh, well, uprising takes different forms, either in strikes or in riots, or how do those, of course, this is the terrain of the historians that we were talking about, Mounier, Porchnev, Thompson. Are these important actually historically, or are they trivial, right? And of course, Porchnev had a very different view about this and about the popular uprisings and their importance than someone like Mounier. But we would then want to think historically about the series of uprisings that we have seen recent times, uh, whether it was Occupy Wall Street, Nuit Debout, Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020, abolition, defund the police movements, and others as well, like the MAGA movement today, right? So we would need to historically, so we could situate these in the dimensions of space in terms of how are these interpolating and transforming people, shaping resistance. How is the repression functioning as well? And what is it doing, particularly in the area of criminal law and punishment? And then historically over time, um, how do these contribute to history in a way? And I think that rereading Marx and Foucault and those who built on their work, James C. Scott, and of course all the abolitionists who are writing today, would really provide some helpful guideposts for this examination and for understanding this space, and could also possibly help us, because I think that this is a really key piece of this particular archive, of the Marx and Foucault archive on crime and punishment, is the way in which it then links to the existing movement for abolition today in the United States, and the way in which so many of the thinkers who are involved in the abolition movement today, thinkers like Angela Davis or Dorothy Roberts, really start from the premise. I mean, and they themselves were part of the premise of disconnecting crime and punishment and realizing that punishment serves other functions, right, that are completely detached from deterring or retributing against harm and crime. Now, so that brings me back then to you and your work. And as we were preparing the seminar, you were reflecting on some of the ways in which this makes you rethink some social movements today. And I wanted to ask that question. How then does it make you rethink social movements today, in both in theory and practice? And particularly, we were talking about the Gilets jaunes movement in France. So yeah, could you like take all of this archive now in a way and help us see the way in which it really has traction in helping to understand present transformations of subjectivities and understandings of resistance and repression?
So many questions. So just one thing about what you said about the law of
And make sure to use your
microphone
so that the Zoom people on Zoom can hear you.
What you said about the law of cooperation, I think it's very interesting because it's no longer based on individuals, but on something like a relationship, or if by relationship we understand not something as a bridge between individuals existing in themselves or before the relationship. So if something as a law of cooperation exists, it means that somehow we deconstruct, we attack the idea of the individual. We attack the idea of private property, of individualisme propriétaire. And
which was actually where we were at the last seminar, right? I mean, or at least
when Etienne insisted on an ontology of relation in Marx, and I think it's exactly that point.
Right. Finding a way to displace the individual as the metric and the measure of everything, and replacing it with some notion of the collective, right? Yeah.
Which is a modern invention.
Right.
Just a modern invention.
Right.
And,
right.
So, and well, about social control exercised from the top down, today it seems to me that transformation of the relations of power are also exercised in other ways. For example, in more powerful ways, in the way we manage our behaviors to correspond to valued models, for example. You were insisting on crime and punishment. I was thinking it's exactly the title of the article of Gary Baker, Crime and Punishment.
An economic approach.
The question of the modification of behaviors is more important than the question of the penalty. How to prevent, that is, how to modify behaviors before let people acting. And I think it's the reality of crime today is that one: prevention, injunction, and the way in which we are let's act, but our freedom is entirely defined, entirely maybe not, but most of it defined by a system of determination we are not aware. So you ask the problem with protests. The problem is that the protests are often, and maybe always after a certain time, recoded by power or re-included by power. Resistance changes over time, and has to. And has to, because the relations of power change. And because we have to anticipate somehow, not only react, but anticipate the mutation of the state of power. All the practices are historical, all the subjects are historical. And because both practices and let's say the social composition of political and social subjects change. For example, where are the prolétaires nowadays? I don't want to say that the concept of class has no value. I just want to say that the concept of class has to be reopened or entirely redefined on the basis of a new economy of value, of a new political economy corresponding to this kind of economy, And because, for example, I imagine in the US, but in France, we don't need anymore an industrial working class. But we need précariat, précariat cultivé et qualifié. And it's not so different. I mean, from the point of view of the condition of the concrete material conditions of life of people, is exactly the same. The questions are the same. The question of the time, fundamental. The question of the not the body anymore, but the brain. And this kind of change, I think, lets us redefine what is, or what we can understand by social class or political class, and then the possibilities on the horizon of struggles, of possible struggles. But we have to we have to accept that. I mean, E.P. Thompson was right. The class is not a structure and it's not a category. The class is the reflect of a certain set of conditions in a precise moment. So the Gilets jaunes, I've not, I mean, I didn't participate in it, and I just observed as, because I'm curious, because I read newspapers, and because I was wondering what it is, what is happening. And the yellow jackets were interesting because no one could name them and say what they were. They were old, young, employed, unemployed, urban, but also de la province et de la campagne. The beginning was a tax riot, exactly that, as les nu-pieds, les révoltes fiscales. The origin was this one, but it was against precarity, it was against low wages, it was against la loi travail, it was against, and so on. And so this special complex social composition of this kind of subject, how do you say, tenir en échec, a tenu en échec the possibilities of objectivation of that kind of subject. For why?
Didn't allow for
Blocked.
form, blocked. Yeah, blocked forms of.
Blocked any possibility of identification. For a while, not forever. And that doesn't mean that there were no ambiguities in that subject, a lot of ambiguities, and not very nice. But it's not the problem. What is interesting me is how a new subjectivity, collective subjectivity, can emerge in certain conditions. And this is powerful. No name, a total new agenda, investing Saturdays, for example. In France, the days, the classical days for protests are Tuesday and Thursday. Saturday is weekend, is free time, no work. And the rond-point, which is not the square, which is not neither the park, not of square, Gezi Park, it's totally new. Why? It was like a new political grammar elaborating itself through the practices, and a new subject constituting itself in common practices, shared practices. This is not enough to say that it was a bad or a good movement, and it's not my problem. I'm interested in the new.
Good, great. Okay, yes, I think we're going to open it up to questions now. Do we have a microphone that we can pass to the audience? Anthony? Let me get that. Let's start with 2 questions. And then I'll see if on the Zoom as well. And then come up for another.
So I try to say in English. In your text, Foucault described that the syndicat magistrat applied the formal law in a rigid and very. But today we have a kind of syndicat magistrat that is revolutionary and very free. And I don't think that the explanation of Foucault applied for them today. What do you think?
Oh, well,
Okay.
the syndicat de la magistrature is a very precise thing. It's a union, but it's a union founded, I think, in 68, and it was a very liberal, left-wing union. It's not exactly the critical legal studies, but it's a movement of protest against. I don't know. I don't know what they do, if they do something now, because I'm not a lawyer. I know that some spaces in the civil society in France somehow play this kind of function. For example, La Ligue des Droits de l'Homme, which is a place from which this kind of questioning the right, the kind of right is expressed.
Grégoire. Oh, and also, just feel free to introduce yourself. Sorry, but yeah, go ahead, Grégoire.
All right, then I'm Grégoire. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a student at the EHESS. And I was wondering, like, so basically one of the problem Bernard Arcot mentioned was the question of the translation, I think, of form of resistance into legal, like the legal translation of forms of resistance. And so basically what you were saying made me think about that, about the Gilets jaunes. Like, because the organization of the movement was like entirely new, right? So no representation, for instance, it was a big part of the movement and of the claims of the movement. And we also saw then like how they basically faced like raw violence from police, but also like how I'd say a lot of their aspirations were not translated. So would you think of that as like an example of, yeah, somehow you have to translate in the words of the power to be like understood? Or yeah, that's my question basically.
It depends what you mean by translation. I mean, if it's the necessity to translate into a grammar, which is, for example, the grammar, the political grammar of representation. No.
Why am I not hearing?
It's precisely the refusal of this kind of grammar, which is not the refusal of democracy, but a kind of a subtype of democracy, which actually doesn't work anymore, almost in France, since for the last 22 years, Chirac 2002. So because we discovered that in order to defend democracy, we are supposed to vote against, in some cases, against our own ideas, which is exactly the negation of democracy. So this crisis of representative democracy, which is not democracy, but a kind of democracy, a version of democracy. If les Gilets jaunes were asked to correspond to this kind of necessity, have un porte-parole, for example. No, I think it was inacceptable to translate or to change their own language. The problem is material. For example, how do we do without un porte-parole to explain concretely?
Like we
What
can,
kind of
I'd like to
function,
do it.
what kind of organization, what kind of how is it organized an assembly? They organized a lot of assemblies. What are the rules, if not the choice of that one, in order to give porter la parole. I don't know. I don't know. What do you mean by translation?
Precisely about that, perhaps like the kind of the trap we are in, like, because if you decide to translate, which means play by the rules, then somehow you're betraying what you were first fighting for. But if you don't, then like,
you're excluded.
Yeah,
Expelled.
And I think this question also like raised the idea of perhaps the centrality of the law, and like, because we were talking about like how we can perhaps like work from the law, and like the law of the board, the law of the ticket, etc. But like perhaps it also invites us to rethink the centrality of the law itself.
Yeah, I don't know. I was wondering. Years ago, before teaching at the university, I taught in a high school in the north of the Parisian suburbs in Saint-Saint-Denis during the riots in 2005, October. And actually, the beginning of the riots were in one of my classes. So it was amazing, fascinating, hard. And I just tried to understand what was happening. And they were, I mean, it's not a problem to know if it was right or wrong, legal or illegal. Of course, it was illegal to burn cars, and so it was bad. And my function as teacher was, no, please, no. But the problem was another. It was that they were telling us a lot of things with another language. And they were totally denied in this prise de parole, as you could say, Michel de Certeau. And so the most of the newspapers said, and the political power said, ils sont aphasiques. They have a kind of, how you say, aphasia. And they are unproductive. They have no words and no economical value. So they are dead. Socially, they are dead. And politically, they are dead. They don't exist. And so the problem of translation is that one. What kind of translation, if the political space open up to new practices and languages, not illegal, different, and create spaces for that kind of expression, you can have the dream one day that these people who are marginalized, excluded, will be maybe somehow not reintegrated, because it's not the problem, but they will have a place with the others, as the others. if instead of that you think that the translation is the acceptation of the condition that power fix, define, and imposes to the others, I think it's not acceptable.
Okay, so we've got Mikhaïl Xifaras with us, and he's going to jump in. I'm going to try and make sure the technology works so that we don't get feedback. I'm going to turn him on. As I mentioned several times, Mikhaïl Xifaras has written the major pieces, the best pieces on Le Vol des Bois, both of which actually are linked on the website. So actually, I'll make sure they're linked. Mikhaïl, hold on for a second. Okay, let's see if this works.
Yes, shall I? Does that work?
Hold on. Hold on. I need to unmute what?
Okay. So you want me to continue to
hold on for a
speak in
second.
order to do the test?
Keep on talking just a little bit so that I can see if we can hear
Okay,
you.
so well, first, thank you very much, Bernard, for all your kind words. Obviously, they are far too kind.
Hold on. Yeah, that's good. Thank yous are good right now because I'm trying to make sure that the sound is working.
Okay.
My
thank
volume
you,
is
Judith.
on all the way up. Is there,
Okay.
oh, press stop here.
Yes, thank you, Judith, for your amazing.
Is it okay?
Is that all right?
All right, go ahead, try it.
Okay, I try. So, no, really, thank you to both for those two reasons. But Bernard, you're far too kind. So, not question, just a remark. I must say, there's in the Marx text is really crazy, and there are hundreds of ideas that today have no interest at all, I think. So, for example, there are entire developments about the
No,
nature.
we're having it. This is not working.
Doesn't
This
work?
is not
Okay.
working. Hold on.
No, forget it. Forget it. We don't have time. Ask someone else to, I mean, we'll continue the conversation together and it's going to be nice anyway. So please go on. Someone else in the room.
Does anyone have any solutions here, Anthony?
Use your own speakers, your computer speakers, and
Okay, good idea. I can hear everything clearly. So I think people on Zoom can hear everything clearly. On Zoom, it's all okay, except that we can't very well hear in this room. But what did you say? Use my mic and then put the mic, put the mic in, put my mic on him.
Bernard,
Okay.
this is too
No,
complicated.
Mikhaïl, don't worry.
What I have to say is not that important. I mean, give someone else.
Okay, here.
Before.
Marche maintenant. Vas-y.
Okay. So I was saying that I think this Marx text is completely crazy and most of this is absolutely nonsensical. So we shouldn't fetishize it. I'm not even sure that the interest of the text is political. So for example, I don't know what to do with the idea of a right of poverty without essentializing poverty, which is what Marx does and does not interest me. So for me, the interest of the text is precisely to answer to Judith's question. How do we use the language of the law, the language of rights in political conflict? How do we try to make it emancipatory? And on this, it's true that this text is offering some intuitions, some ideas for some tools for a critique of the legal language, a critique of the language of rights that can be useful. Something like an internal critique of the law. That's why I think it's a very important text. But that requires a lot of constructive reading. That requires to wonder, what are the questions I want to ask to this text? And to me, there are two main questions to ask. Maybe many others, actually, but that's the questions I'm asking. One is, you have a very heavy political fight at the time. And by the way, also a judicial fight. So the communities of peasants they won in court. They were recognized as entitled to customary rights on the wood. And the whole thing is capitalists want to transform those forests into a capitalist commodity. And that's all about how can I criticize capitalism without being with the conservative, which in theory translates into how can I criticize Hegel without being Savigny, Savigny being the arch conservative and the minister of legislation in Prussia. And the answer will be to play Savigny against Hegel, Hegel against Savigny, and to get emerges the question of classes, emerges the question of the position and the situation of the poor. And that's how Marx is able to navigate this political problem of how to posit himself. And how? By wondering what are the material interests at stake. Who's winning? Who's losing? Who's going to do what? Who's going to get more? Who's going to get less? Something that an analysis of what law distributes, which is a kind of internal critique. The second question is about the unity of the legal system. And is there a relation between the development of capitalist property and criminalization and prison, le grand enfermement? And Marx's answer is absolutely yes. So the criminalization is an effect of the transformation of civil law, and more specifically, right of property. So it's precisely within the context of the judicial defeat of the owners, because they've been recognized, the peasants have been recognized customary rights on the wood to impose capitalist property. The owners will A, go through legislation, not courts, and B, criminal law, not civil law. And so it's the story, this text is a story of a judicial strategy to impose capitalist property. And how do you impose capitalist property? Well, you create new illegalisms against the courts, against the tribunals. So there's something like an internal critique of this new capitalist property, which is saying something like, okay, you think that property is going to emancipate you because it's individual, because it's against the old customs, because it's against the old feudal order, but actually this emancipation of the individual, you will pay a super heavy price, which is the criminalizing of the non-owners. It's going to benefit only the owners, and the non-owners will go to jail. So that, I find, is a very interesting analytics. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mikhaïl. Hold on. Mute what? Mute my Zoom now? Okay. All right. I'll do that. Okay. Okay. Chose au sujet de... Non, c'était super. Yes, c'était... Is the way in which there is always... I mean, the way in which you have to look beneath the surface of the obvious conflict to see what's going on and how there are fissures, even within kind of that space of the constitutional court making a certain decision about rights, and the legislature using a particular aspect of the law against another piece of the law. So it's kind of like this subtle, the requirement of a subtle reading of conflict underneath the obvious and apparent easier reading, I think, is what Mikhaïl is pointing at, I think. And I mean, so, and it makes me think about the question that it raises for me really is how do we kind of deploy those internal unseen battles and struggles of power that go on in such a way as to kind of push them in a direction that could be helpful politically. And it reminds me of something. I know this is going to feel very different, but it actually does remind me of something. I was down in Alabama a couple of weeks ago working on a case, and I was working with someone who is kind of an investigator, a news reporter, someone who's completely in the deep trenches of all of the relations of power. And it was so clear to me from listening to what was going on in this community that there were so many conflicts and rivalries between the law enforcement agencies and between this particular judge and that particular district attorney and that particular investigator and that police department versus the sheriff's department and these people and whatnot, that you have to kind of really dig deep into these. And this is, of course, this is what Foucault's notion of relations of power is all about, right? Is that it's not as clean cut as what we're used to, right? That was the opposition to, class struggle in a way. It's not that clean, right? There's all kinds of, and if we can do that in the same way that Mikhaïl was talking about these different legal pushes from different directions that have consequences, some at a constitutional level, some at a civil level, some at the criminal level, etc. But if we ourselves in our own forms of resistance can also see that and turn that somehow to the advantage of, in this case, the precarious or others. Yeah, good. Thank you, Mikhaïl. Let me see. I had one more in the room. I also have Igor Schecherbrod who wants to try. So we're going to do with one in the room, and then we're going to do Igor, and then we'll wrap it up. Thanks, Mikhaïl.
Yeah, hello. So I'm Jana Ndjai-Berankova. I'm an architecture and philosophy scholar and a fellow here. And I sort of wanted to go back to Marx's text, perhaps also reacting to what Mikhaïl just said, because my problem with this text is perhaps that, when you read it, it's really, for me, like personally, it's really difficult to read it without kind of projecting retrospectively this category of the primitive accumulation on this text. And I know Judith kind of alluded to that, so I was wondering if either Judith or Michal could perhaps develop more on that. The second aspect when reading this text is what I would say, there's also a kind of an epistemological side of this text, which I find really strange in a certain way. When, for instance, Marx talks about the way how, in a way, mentioning this case of the Roman law, how there's something indeterminate in the political space on which there's projected this kind of determinate definitive category of the law, separating it into private property, which at one point into a form of a private property, which in one moment he kind of compares to the form of theft, thus blurring the notion between, what's legal, what's illegal, saying that, in what sense isn't private property itself a form of theft. Therefore, there's this movement, this kind of an imposition of something, an abstract category, onto something which originally was kind of fluid and indeterminate. We could say it's this movement of saisir et séparer. And I was just like, maybe besides this question of primitive accumulation, like rereading this text, I was just like, as a side remark, it just made me think of like how useful this text on, theft of wood could be actually for, analyzing urban planning into certain, which is a field in which I work in architecture too. So it just made me think how useful it might be also to comprehend certain logics of space, for instance, in the cities of urban South with all the so-called informal practices, which kind of contest the real estate value and the kind of tracé of the, property and the appropriation of space by certain people. And it's just like, again, I'm not going to go into much detail, but it just makes me think about how useful this text can actually be for these kind of problems. But anyway, my question was more about the primitive accumulation and how to delineate the borders between what he tries to describe here and the later notion of primitive accumulation.
Great, thank you. Let me take one more question and then maybe we'll close up, okay? So it's going to be Igor on Zoom. So just give me a minute, Igor, to figure this out again, okay? Hold on. I'll tell you when I'm ready. Okay, I put this on. This on. All right, let's give it a shot.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Bernard? Testing, testing.
Okay, no.
Testing.
Go ahead, talk.
Okay, testing, testing. Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so the first, just to get your reactions on the tension in Marx's Law on the Thefts of Wood between rational right and customary right. So the problem with appealing to customary right is that the landed aristocracy or the forest owners could just as well appeal to customary right. So there's a contradiction there because the very young Marx still has a standard of rational right. I think Mikhaïl is quite right that he could fall back on to assess positive law, which he regards as unjust. So that's tension between rational right, the positive law, and customary right, if you can elaborate on that. And the second point is just a book that was published by Daniel Ben Said, Marx's Law on the Thefts of Wood and the Right of the Poor. I think it's worth mentioning because he tries to figure out ways in which Marx's account can still be used for contemporary circumstances to address those without papers, those without property, and so on and so forth. So just want to get your reactions on those two things. I agree with much of what Mikhaïl said, except that it's nonsensical, the law on the thefts of wood, but I think he's exaggerating. Thanks very much.
Well, I think the historical model in this text is totally different from the end of the first book of the Capital. We don't have any mention of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, for example. We don't have any mention on contradictions. There is no description of the transformation of peasantry. So I think we have a few elements in this text which allow us to imagine the conception that Marx in 1842 has of history. And it's, I mean, for example, the element I mentioned before of an intuition of right, of an instinct of right, which is supposed to join something as a rational right at the end of the process. And so it's an entirely Hegelian conception of history. And of course, this is not the conception in the the primitive accumulation. So it's the first element. So about the second question, I don't know, but it seems to me that the definition of a customary right of aristocracy, which developed itself in absence of any right, is a thing. And the customary right of the poor, which is promised to this eventual reconjunction in a rational right at the end of a process, are two different evolutions. I don't know how to say it. It's deux lignes différentes. And so one can say, and it's of course probably logic, that he has no sense, and this distinction between two different customary rights is not founded on concrete material elements. But it seems to me that in the one hand, it's the force de l'habitude, and on the other, it's something like ce qui reste des privilèges. When he says in absence of any rights, in the space in which there is no right, we have this customary right of the rich, of the aristocracy. In the French translation, it's not aristocratie, c'est le droit coutumier supérieur dans la traduction française, et c'est plus intéressant. Le droit coutumier supérieur, et the other c'est le droit coutumier des pauvres.
Yeah, well, I think that one has to treat, well, let me just say a few things and then maybe you can have the last word, but I think one has to treat this text not as a fully consistent legal theory. There are inconsistencies in the text, deep inconsistencies. The notion of, as Mikhaïl Xifaras has shown, and I try to talk about this a little bit in the introduction, which talks more about the legal aspects. As Mikhaïl Xifaras has shown, it's a peculiar but interesting kind of, it's an international customary law of the poor that transcends nations, etc., that transcends history almost, and has a scientific feel to it. But you have to understand that there are also different theories of law in this text, and they're kind of meddled together in a very kind of, rhetorical way. There's this idea, right, of the law being regulated according to the legal nature of things, right, which is a very natural law idea. This idea of the immortality of the law. So there are lots of rhetorical turns. There's an intuitive idea of the law, which you spoke about, the intuitive idea, which he really intuits the relationship between live and dead wood to the classes in a way, right? So these are lots of different theories. There's some of it is slightly conservative legal propositions in terms of going back more towards feudal orders and feudal codes. So I think that there's a lot there, not to kind of develop Marx's theory of law, but to think about different critiques that would be available in a situation like this. Now, on the question of the rational right or reason or rationalization, I think there's also a fascinating piece in Marx's text where he talks about how rationalization or administration can actually have political implications. And I think this is really insightful and really helpful. and something that Foucault picked up on. He's discussing the transition from customary traditions to a system of objectively delineated rights, right? From a condition of privileges to a system of rights. And he shows how simplification or parsimony or rationalization or modernization actually can have political effects. He speaks about this in the context of the monasteries and their transition to private property. And he shows how kind of in the process of that privatization, there are certain privileges that used to benefit the poor, the accidental support from the monasteries that simply fall by the wayside, right? It's something about, and this is fascinating, something about the way in which modernization, rationalization, which we think of as being completely neutral politically, or notions of parsimony, which we think of in economics as being, well, you know, Occam's razor, right? It's almost, wow. It's like what he's trying to show is Occam's razor is political. It has political consequences. Things are going to fall by the wayside when you start getting rid of those elements that we can't always see well and understand well. And when you reduce to models and to rationalizations, it's a political enterprise. It's this notion of, he calls it one-sidedness. In French, it's exclusiveness. That is the product of reason in a way. And actually, what's really interesting is when you look at the notes that Foucault took on the vol des bois, if you could throw up the slide there, he's particularly interested in the role of reason. Let's see, it's the other one. Yeah, can you go up a little bit on that one? Sorry, on that one. Can you, no, on the other one, sorry. That one. Can you go down? Sorry, can you go down? Yeah, rôle de la raison, right? Rôle de la raison. He's particularly interested in the rôle de la raison. Surprise, surprise. Right? I mean, he's got reason, folie de raison right now in his mind, probably as he's writing it, right? And the role of reason is to render the world one-sided, right? And he cites this paragraph. In English, it's the character of a thing is a product of understanding. And that's, but in French, it's translated as raison, actually. Le caractère des choses est un produit de la raison, right? And then on the next page, at the top of the next page, he continues this and he writes, noting down the passage, after writing down the passage, he writes, from which there is the resulting contradiction. Reason has eliminated the ambiguity of the medieval conception of property, partly private, partly public. Reason made it the privileges of the lords, but reduced the poor to misery, right? Notice it's reason, right? Of course, which would be the source of fascination at this point. But I think that shows the way in which there are these little gems in this text, multiple little gems that you can pull on. In that context, it's really only coming out of something about rational right versus customary right, and yet it can give us great insight. I mean, I think today we see the way in which these parsimonies and whatnot transform our world, right? The way all of the regulations for COVID and now the regulations for the in reaction to the protests that are taking place on campus, right? How we rationalize things and we say they don't have political consequences, but they do. That our communities are closed. You know, you can't have a public seminar anymore. You can't get people on campus anymore, right? And we've got a whole security apparatus that comes up in kind of a rationalized way, but that has terrible effects on the community, on the public, on our own conversations, on our ability to speak and see each other and work with each other. It comes right out of that, the role of reason in a way. So Igor, so those are some thoughts on kind of the relationship between the rational right and the customary right. But I think we need to bring this to a close. And so I want to give you Judith the last word for some final thoughts and reflections.
The only reflection is that what is reading a text? I think it's a good question. Reading a text involves both thinking the text into its context, past context, but maybe also it may be more than classical academic interpretation, the way in which he moves us and he goes beyond its own position, and it's the reason why the text is somehow alive, even if it's a text of 1842.
Right. Judith, thank you so much for your presentation, for this intervention, for the conversation that you created, and thank you all for being here. It's been a spectacular seminar. I thank you so much. We meet next, it'll be in New York. It'll be in November, and I forget what the date is, but we'll be turning to Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, his article on the Jewish question, and Claude Lefort's writings about rights and human rights, and his kind of response to on the Jewish question. We'll be doing it with Gene Cohen, and we'll be at Columbia University. And so I look forward to seeing you there, and or on Zoom. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Anthony, for all the work. Thank you, Isabella, for helping out as well, and everyone else. Okay. Thank you, Judith.
Non, mais les réponses, c'est vraiment une énorme différence.
Merci.
Non, mais non, merci.